For this next panel, there's been a lot of chatter. Many of you are here because perhaps you're working within your large multinational, things like that, to set up a new innovation, or maybe looking at corporate venture. Want to understand how you can do that, or if you just started, how you can best take advantage of that sort of thing. We have really heavy hitters in this particular panel. So, getting dinosaurs to dance, corporate innovation, and startup partnerships. This particular panel, we are joined by Matt Garrett, who currently serves as Vice President of Salesforce Ventures, where he's completed over 40 investments and acquisitions in enterprise SaaS companies. Prior to Salesforce, he was Vice President at Battery Ventures, where he invested in early-stage enterprise software and green IT companies. We have Jeff Pashalides. Jeff is Head of Business Development at Sequoia Capital. Jeff's work crosses all departments, working with CIOs on internal IT projects, CTOs and business executives on tech-enabled new business, and corporate development teams on investing and strategy. We also have Dave McClure. Dave McClure is a founding partner at 500 Startups. Excuse me. Dave uses his uncanny ability to function without sleep and frequent flyer miles to uncover geeks around the world. His ominous past includes working at Founders Fund, Facebook FB Fund, PayPal, Mint.com, and Simply Hired. We also have Tom Frangione. Tom is the COO of Greylock Partners, which he joined back in 2010. Prior, Tom co-founded and served as the CEO of 2 venture-backed startups, Simply Continuous and Telefio. Moderating this panel, we also have, joining us again, Paresh Dave from the Los Angeles Times as well. Some of them are still getting mic'd up right now as we join the back, but for those who are mic'd up, why don't you help me welcome them to the stage. Thanks, Dave. Jeff. Thanks, sir.
Is it the side?
Yeah, I'll go here.
I'll go over here. Short guys together. All right. Keep it together.
I think last panel of the day. Hopefully it's the best. So I figured we'd start on looking at what's sort of the biggest thing that's changed the last couple of years in corporate venture capital. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the biggest thing that's changed is that there are so many new buyers from non-tech, from other countries. So maybe, Dave, since you do, you're always traveling, it seems like. I mean, what are you seeing around the rest of the world? I mean, are there really a lot of new buyers? Is that the biggest thing that's changed the last couple of years?
I think that's definitely more people at the table. I don't know if the buying is happening at scale yet, but there's certainly a lot of Chinese, I guess I would say potential acquirers who have other reasons to try and want to get money out of China, so not just necessarily for strategic reasons, but also for currency and other reasons. But I think you're seeing lots of non-tech acquirers, so some of the folks that Mark had mentioned earlier in the day, GM certainly, Unilever, all those folks are maybe not the traditional people that you're going to see buying companies from a Silicon Valley perspective, but I think we're going to see more and more and more of that.
And what's the significance of that? I mean, what does that do?
I mean, I think it opens up a whole new world of buyers. If you look at, I think there were about 1,500 tech acquisitions last year, and roughly half of them were by non-tech companies, which is pretty phenomenal. And so I think that it brings in more capital to invest in the categories, and you're also seeing now the entrance of a bunch of private equity buyers, and so that's fantastic as well. And I'm really excited about the entrance of a lot of the non-tech buyers, and I think basically what's signaling is many companies have to become tech-enabled businesses, whether they're tech businesses. In one of our portfolio companies. Oh, yeah. Should I say everything again?
Yes.
It was amazing.
Can do the
Sure.
sign language.
Exactly.
So to paraphrase,
Wait, I don't want too long.
okay, can you hear me? Is it on? No. Yes? No.
Yes.
Yes, all right. So 1,500 tech acquisitions last year, roughly half were by non-tech buyers. I think that's incredibly exciting. We actually had one of our portfolio companies, ServiceMax, was acquired by GE. That was great as well. And I think you're also seeing this entrance of private equity coming in and paying. Typically, you think of private equity as being inexpensive value buyers. They're buying at multiples that are that of strategic. So I think those are all great signs for investors in the startup community.
So if you are a company, I mean, you startup, I mean, where should you be thinking about these corporate VCs? I mean, should we think about them as soon as you form your company? Should we think of them at a Series D? I mean, where does it step in? I see you laughing.
Yeah, I guess I would say is, you have to understand what you're trying to get or accomplish from that relationship. And it's not always the right answer that the time should be early or late. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So we see folks that are trying to leverage that for things like product market fit, right? But you want, in our opinion, to get a successful company off the ground, you want to see that product market fit feedback from multiple companies, not just one. So a lot of those kind of things, I think we tend to, if you had to make a blanket rule, you'd say, kind of corporate or strategic investors probably makes a little sense a little bit later, like once you've kind of gotten technology risk out of the product or some things like that. But that's not a hard and fast rule because.
But how do you, if you're just starting out and you want to see, if there's interest in your product out there in the market,
Yep.
how do you find the right players? How do you get started talking with them? What's worked? What hasn't worked?
Look, I think there's lots of different ways to do it. So part of it, as a young company, you need to think about all the different folks you need to partner with. So for example, one of the things both Jeff and I spend a good amount of time on is trying to interact with CIOs, CTOs, folks from large enterprises that have interest in understanding what young companies are doing to push either technical or innovative business systems, and how we can build the right relationships with those enterprises so that when we have interesting portfolio companies or other companies we see, we can introduce them. But that's only one way to do it. Like another way is just think about advisors that have great customer contacts, right? Another way to do it is just seed stage investors. Dave, I'm sure you and your team help connect with customers all the time. So part of it is, in my opinion, when you're starting a young company or starting to think about all the different players you want to assemble around yourself, that should be one of the vectors. How do I get that customer interaction? And it doesn't always have to be in the way of an investment, at least in my opinion.
I would say the primary advantage that corporate VC has over traditional VC is customers and distribution.
Yep.
If they are able to structure that in a way that's effective for startups, then they have a dramatic advantage. If they don't have a way to structure that, then I think that isn't always going to be a tool that they can use. But,
But Jeff, how do you make sure that, as a startup, you actually get something out of, a relationship, or that you don't get taken advantage of in some way?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is I think doing your diligence up front. So I think you shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. When you do these types of things, you should find someone who's been through it before with that particular corporate to figure out how they acted in that circumstance. And I think past behavior is very indicative of future behavior.
What questions or things should you be looking at?
Figure out what drives them, what really creates value out of their relationship, who are the decision makers, do they act quickly, do they act slowly, how do you figure out when they're real, when they're not real, that type of thing. I think I think there's a normal cadence because a lot of this has organizational culture built into it, and so if it's working well in one scenario, it's likely to work well again, and I think it's reasonably predictable.
So flip side of the table, are you buying this?
I mean, I think it's a lot of good points, and I think it depends on who the strategic is. I mean, for us, what we say is, look, and we're different than a lot of, the presentation that they were showing earlier was look, if you're a platform company,
you're different in that you're not evil like Fred was.
That's right. We're not evil. No, but if you're looking, it depends how you want to partner with someone. But what we always say is, look, basically people often want access to our customer base and our ecosystem. And so what we advise companies is, once you start bumping into our customers, and you have an idea of how you want to work with us and how you integrate, you kind of have to tell the story too. Because I think the mistake that a lot of startups make is like, oh, you guys have a lot of customers. I have some cool stuff. Like, will you sell me to your customers? And that's the absolute wrong way to approach it. You need to really come in and like bring something to the table and have thought out like, why do you want to partner with this? And you have to be, I think, selective on who you're trying to engage with. You can't just go and blanket everybody. You need to be targeted.
But why can't you be that magic solution that gets me all the distribution I want?
Because we have our own AEs that are selling, our stuff, and we have a large partner ecosystem, and so they can't think, they have enough to think about of all the things that are in their bag. Right. To think about all the other things that all these partners are doing, it gets harder. But if you're, doing something in a specific area and you're making that sale easier, you're de-risking it, like you're a partner and you're pulling us into accounts, you start doing that, then you see a lot of reciprocity. So a lot of times you have to get the flywheel going before you can really see that acceleration. At least that's how we view it a lot of times, and that's how we advise companies when you're working with us. It's not just like, all right, here's the monies, we're going to turn the switch on.
I think too often people are looking at corporate capital as a way to start a thing when really it should be supporting a commercial relationship.
That's
and
right.
So if Salesforce is going to be bringing one of our startups into their customer base, it's because those two things are very complementary and they've got a proper commercial reason to be doing business. Oftentimes the venture relationship can help support that and accelerate it, but it really shouldn't be driving it.
Look, I think the other thing to know, and you saw that from some of Mark's stuff, is right now in the market, there is plenty of capital, right? So a corporate investing is great, but it's not massively differentiated, right? So there's plenty of capital.
Incredibly undifferentiated.
That's right. That's right. And so from the perspective of both a young company needs to bring something to the corporate, but the corporate needs to bring more than capital because there's a lot of capital sloshing around.
So what are the options for big companies or medium-sized companies, whatever size company that wants to invest in a startup? I mean, we've seen accelerators pop up like crazy the last 3 years. I think, Dave, you've said really nothing comes out of that maybe. Is that true?
I think there's PR that comes out of it. I would say that the yield on accelerators is small and long-term. And so unless you're doing accelerators at scale and willing to be patient, I don't think that matters.
And at scale means what, like a new class every month? Or?
I would say if your expectation is you're getting more than 5 to 10% interesting companies out of an accelerator program, you're kidding yourself, unless you're talking about just talent yield.
Yep.
And I think you're probably talking about a 3 to 5 year time scale at least to see real impact. So, let's just say the average corporate that probably is thinking about doing something like that is probably a multi-billion-dollar company. I think it's sort of a waste of time to think about accelerators having an impact in the near term for that company in any measurable scale.
From a financial perspective.
But what's wrong about looking at the 5-year horizon and doing that?
I don't think most corporates plan for that long. Certainly most people running corporate accelerator programs, if you look at the trajectory on those, they often aren't renewed for more than 1 or 2 years.
Right.
I think that's wrong, but I'm just being practical and realistic about that.
But I actually think there can be a role for a corporate that is, I'll say, trying to learn about an entrepreneurial ecosystem to find ways to partner with existing accelerators as a way to kind of frankly accelerate their own learning curve. And once again, I don't think it's a financial return, but part of the notion I think behind accelerators, if you were going to partner with one, is to engage quickly, to see many, many young companies and watch them go through the process and start forming your own types of filters about what's important and what's not.
I would agree with that. I mean, we're doing a partnership with GM right now where that's kind of the idea on discovery. I'm just saying that scale is important in that.
Agreed.
And so if you're only doing 5 to 10 companies...
Is it about 500-ish startup? is that the right number?
That's a great name.
Yeah.
I think we might use that.
Interesting.
But I think sometimes the corporates have different activities that they're doing that are not at all coordinated. So they might have an accelerator program, they might have an innovation program, they might have a direct investment program, they might have a VC arm, and they might have acquisition, right? And I think all of those should probably be coordinated.
That's a good point.
I think the big change that you were asking about, the big change that you were asking about that I see is that there's tons of corporates coming into the VC business that don't realize they're VCs. And if you think about like
That's a
what
good
do
call.
VCs sort of do, well, we try and generate deal flow, we try and make good selections, and then we try and help the companies grow, right? And even on the very first step of that, just thinking about deal flow, I don't think most corporates understand how that works from a startup perspective, right? So as
And in
if I
your
use
mind, that means what? Like, how should it work?
well, so I could look at an accelerator as one way to become aware of companies. I could do conferences as another way. I could do an investment in a fund that has a sector or specific focus and let them help do some of that discovery. There's many, many different ways that corporates could start to get companies on their radar to select from. And not just that they're aware of them, but also that the corporate looks cool or sexy to those companies. If you think about like the differences between having Google or Facebook as your acquirer versus, sorry to use an example, but Yahoo, that's probably a lot less sexy for somebody in tech, and so money is not always going to be the only thing that's differentiating that.
True.
And for non-tech acquirers, that's going to be even more the case. So I think corporates generally need to start thinking about how am I a bright, shiny object to startups? How do I get my eyes on lots of different startups? And then how would I close that deal with sort of my unique, differentiated access to customers or capital or something?
What's the starting point to become a bright, shiny object? Is the first thing flying out to San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Silicon
No.
Beach, something like that, and meeting with companies?
Absolutely
Is that
not.
What's the start?
I mean, it kind of depends on your business, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in a unique market, so to use Salesforce as an example, if you're clearly the winner in the next generation of CRM, it kind of like, it leads to a certain approach you can take in venture, which is a little bit more broad and a little bit, more of a center of gravity. If you're at a different type of industry that's maybe got 10 different players, all of which are peers, or maybe you're a tier 2 or tier 3, it may be a
Let's
different...
take a construction company.
It may be that a different approach makes sense. It may be that you need to put a smaller number of bets, but put more capital to work and put more of a commercial relationship behind it.
But how do you become that bright, shiny object to...
My
I
point
think
is
you have to
you
write
might never be the
checks.
bright shiny object, but you for that particular commercial deal, you are the bright shiny object.
Look, well, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Look, when I just think about like that bright shiny object, to me that means you have earned your reputation, you've earned a level of trust with the entrepreneurial community. So part of that is you have to be in the flow and you have to be doing some things, and you have to show to the community, if you will, that you are you go about your businesses in a certain way that's predictable, so that young companies. Look, one of the problems that I see a lot with large enterprises that are trying to interact with young companies is the normal internal processes of large companies crush young companies, right? So just normal like vetting of an idea that is just very rational and analytic and the exact right approach for a $20 billion company completely destroys young companies. Because I've been in that position with the company I started. We're a company of 50 and we were working with wireless carriers, and so these companies would vet us in the way they vet any vendor. And we basically, after a while, we're like, all right, look, we either need to short circuit this or find a different way to do this vetting, because I don't have enough people to even, help you convince you that this $100,000 contract is going to make any sense, right? So there's things like that as you start figuring out how you're going to play in these markets, you can develop a reputation as well as, your approaches that will become known. Like, I'm speaking mostly of Silicon Valley. Dave, you can probably extrapolate this better outside Silicon Valley. But it's a very small place, and reputations get earned very quickly, and they get known. And so you can earn yourself a reputation as like a great partner, right, to young companies. Is that fair?
I think you have to be doing deals on a regular basis, and you have to move quickly. I think that
That's fair.
If you're a typical corporation with an annual planning process and it takes you a year to make a decision, startups live and die within that time frame.
You'll be on the next round of funding.
And furthermore, the only startups that will work with you are the ones that are most desperate.
And I think it's also, the hardest thing to figure out is why exactly you're doing this and how you're going to benefit. And it sounds easy, but I think you have to drill down a bunch of layers and also have, be realistic in what you're going to deliver to the companies and being realistic in what, on both sides. I just think there needs to be a level of pragmatism. The companies need to be realistic of what they're going to get out of it, and both people need to be realistic about what they're going to give up to get this relationship.
So if accelerators maybe aren't the perfect way to get involved,
I don't think there's a perfect way. I think the thing is that there's a whole bunch of different ways. Corporate venturing is one, accelerators are one, and I think that's probably the point. And there's not a one-size-fit-all, because it's very different how you're going to engage with a platform company like Salesforce or Amazon versus an equipment manufacturer versus a GE who's developing software. So I think it's also different. The types of arrangements and the agreements you're going to have and what you're hoping to get out of it are going to be very different for all those categories of companies.
So tell me about Salesforce. I mean, how did Mark and all of you come to a decision on how you either want to do invest or acquisition? How do you think about that?
So I think we're in a very fortunate spot in that Salesforce is based in Silicon Valley. Our CEO was a founder, so he's generally more forward-thinking, founder-friendly. Much of our company is run by companies that we acquired, or they've grown up with the company, so there's just an entrepreneurial mindset. So I think getting those people will pay attention to startups just inherently. I don't have to convince them, and that's probably one of the hardest things. We're also a platform company. So we already have a go-to-market and business strategy already set up. So once we invest in you, if you build on AppExchange, which is a straightforward, replicable way to go to market together, or if you build on our platform, again, the go-to-market's already set up. And we also invest in a healthy ecosystem. So I don't have to decide, is this a strategic investment, or am I going to make some money off of it? We are completely strategically focused, but we have the benefit of being in a healthy ecosystem. So from that standpoint, we're not having to make those same types of trade-offs, which I think is very challenging for a lot of companies. And so with that mandate, we're really about thinking about how do we build this ecosystem of partners and working with these companies and get engagement at the product level so that we understand, here's what we're thinking about, here's what you're thinking about, this is what our customers want. And so we're really mutually trying to solve solutions that our customers are ultimately going to want, and we have that go-to-market that drives together without having to force any kind of crazy relationship. So I think just by virtue of how we're built, it makes it easier for us to be an investor.
But if you weren't in that fortunate position where your product leaders are thinking about startups all the time and engaging
He's saying if my strategy is be awesome. And awesome.
But how
startups will come to you.
But how would you get people?
Join a really good football team, win Super Bowls, and repeat.
So
if you're the Cleveland Browns,
yes.
How do you become that?
Don't go to the Cleveland
shiny
Browns.
object.
But no, it's hard. I think it's very hard, and I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying I was Battery Ventures for a number of years. I was very skeptical of corporate venture until I moved to Salesforce and said, oh, this actually really works. So I'm also skeptical, but I'm also skeptical of most VCs too. Most VCs aren't very good investors either. So I think you have to find those companies that you can work with well.
I think if you don't have the luxury of being at a place like Salesforce, an example that is personal to me, I used to work at TrueCar, and TrueCar was partnered very closely with USAA. USAA is a great organization, but in Silicon Valley, it's not the bright, shiny object. And so their approach to venture was to have it more tightly tied to strategy, more tightly tied to corporate development. And in the case of TrueCar, they basically said the corporate strategy of USAA is to solve real problems for their members. They already lend into auto, they already insure auto. They're trying to fill out 5 or 6 more pieces of the auto life cycle for their members. And to do that, they said, what can we build in-house and what can't we build out in-house? And having an actual car buying program is complicated. You have to be national, you have to have a footprint that they just weren't able to do in-house. And so they said, we're going to pick the best company and we're going to deeply partner with them. We're going to invest in them to cement that relationship, and we're going to really tie ourselves together. And when TrueCar went public, roughly a third of the business was coming through USAA. TrueCar probably couldn't have existed without them, and USAA couldn't have solved the problem for their member base without TrueCar. And so it's a different model where if you don't presuppose that you're a center of gravity or you're the bright, shiny object, you can take a slightly different approach and you can still move the needle for both parties.
Well, I think a distinction though is they also went long on a partner, right? Whereas I think, whereas ours is very different. We're seeding many partners, and so I think it's an example. It's a great example. It's specific to that corporate partner.
Yeah. Company went public, made a good financial return on the investment. They drove loan volume, they drove insurance volume, and they had a higher member satisfaction. So.
But was the success there that USAA committed and said, we're going to go with the best partner, and that's what we're going to look for, and we're going to move fast? Or how did you have to, from the TrueCar side, what did you have to change about the way USAA works to make it work?
The success was you found 2 people who needed each other. in a way that was fundamental enough that they were willing to actually do it. Yeah, it's a love story at the end of the day.
It always
I think
comes
the
back to
USAA
love.
folks are somewhere in the room. So
No,
you can
but
ask
for
them.
it's kind of in the weeds. But for TrueCar to go present a compelling offering to dealers, the dealer has to be convinced that you're going to bring that new consumer flow into that dealership. And USAA is a massive part of a proprietary consumer flow that TrueCar brings to the table, and it resonates with dealers. And so for TrueCar, it was a guaranteed flow versus the direct to consumer piece was a little bit more up and down.
But these are both actually sales and distribution stories in a way. Like, even though you might say that they're concentrated in one partner, they're bringing customers to that startup. You guys might have lots of partners, but you have AppExchange as kind of a channel that brings
the
your
engagement
startups.
model is different. So too is bright and shiny object. They're not going to have as many bright and shiny objects in their portfolio, and you have to be then it's very targeted. I'm guessing there was a lot of back and forth on getting that agreement together. What didn't happen in a couple weeks, and it was so valuable to both people. They're willing to invest the time.
Yep.
But let's say you do want to make, not just a partnership, but make an acquisition. Why would you be making an acquisition and, wait until the right time when the company is 5 employees, 50 employees, 150 employees? I mean,
Generally with acquisition, you think in terms of talent, product, and business. And so talent might be as many engineers or product or whatever that you need, but that might be a smaller, lesser expensive deal. Product is probably where there's an interesting technology or IP that's maybe not generating revenue at scale or customers at scale, but could for the acquiring business. So there's probably a nice optimization there of startup has product but isn't worth a lot of money yet. Larger acquirer can use that product and bring it to lots of customers.
but is there something about that framework that you think corporate VCs are getting wrong right now?
I don't think
Or
they
corporate
generally,
acquirers,
again,
sorry.
are just agile and moving fast enough. I think for a lot of folks that aren't Salesforce, or let's just generalize that to not tech corporations, I think it's an unfamiliar process.
Just keep it not Salesforce.
I think it's an unfamiliar process for most corporates to figure out how to work with startups. I mean,
But if they're doing an acquisition, the process can drag on.
I think that's the problem. So I mean, we're trying to work with corporates right now to do test drive projects for 3 months. We're going to be working with Deloitte in London and Berlin and France on projects where we explicitly have a time frame that's constrained to 3 months.
Smart.
We present a group of startups to them. We actually give them a menu of 5 to 10 startups to choose from. They'll choose a few, and then we narrow that down to one. And there's a predetermined sort of test drive package for the startup to want to do it and expend some time on it. But we try and make that evaluation period within a 3-month time frame. And then they can sort of take it to the next level, and that might be the beginning of an investment conversation, a partnership conversation, or even an acquisition. But you've sort of got a defined amount of time that won't kill the startup, but also gives the corporate a chance to learn about that startup and their product.
So it's sort of like a 3-month focused due diligence process?
Going steady before you decide to get engaged, I guess.
But I think the dynamic is not investment versus acquisition. It's really partnership versus acquisition. And do you want an investment as part of that partnership?
Yeah, look, I think
that's
acquisition's one end of a spectrum. It shouldn't. I don't think you should go and say, I gotta acquire me some, tech companies.
Fred Wilson thinks so.
That he does. Sorry. And Fred's right. So
What's wrong with
I
that?
take that back.
I think he's right in that, if you believe in something, you should consummate the deal.
Totally agree. But if you are saying, I need to accomplish X, right? And I'll pretend accomplish X is, I need to add, I'll take one of your 3 examples. We need to massively, add a new level of digital, thinking to our product. And we think the best way to do that is going to be either to partner or acquire a company in that space, and we've identified 5 companies. I think it's hard to sit down and then say, and I'm going to acquire one, because that may not be the right answer. So the right answer with TrueCar may have been for USAA, they probably shouldn't own TrueCar. But they were able to deliver on their core value proposition, which was to help their members in ways they've chosen to. through a partnership, right? So I don't know. I'm not a big believer that acquisition's the only answer. I think it's the end of a spectrum, right? And many times it can be the right answer, but I don't know. I'm a big believer there's many different relationships that can make sense.
I think one thing that I've seen happen a lot lately is big acquisitions.
True.
And, I think
Like
probably,
Jet.com size, or what do you mean?
right, or GM and Cruise and, Unilever and Dollar Shave Club.
Yep.
Which I think those are probably because the acquiring company believes there's a lot of value there. They're ready to pay a large price to have impact. But I think the reality is most acquisitions probably don't work out. And even the ones that work out might not scale that much. So I think that in general, a better strategy for corporates is rather than making one big risky acquisition is probably to make a larger number of medium-sized acquisitions with the expectation that probably a lot of them aren't going to work.
And acquisitions are also idiosyncratic because at any given time, this might be a great thing to do, but you have 4 or 5 competing priorities. So maybe you're doing an acquisition over here, you've just bought 2 companies, we really like you, so we should partner, invest, hang out for a while. It's not that, maybe we want to buy you. So there's budget considerations, there's timing considerations. Well, we just, this is a new GM that hasn't been in the seat long enough. So, I think there's a whole bunch of idiosyncratic things that are unique to the circumstance of that company that you also can't do acquisitions at that moment. Maybe you have to push it out 6, 12, 18 months.
So let's go back to the startup mind frame and structuring these deals. Do any of you have a recent horror story of a partnership or something that
we're
just went
willing
wrong?
to tell here on stage.
Exactly.
Four or
That's
500
a more interesting
500 of our closest friends.
How do you make sure as a startup, what do you need to be looking at in a structure of a partnership or even
I think
investment?
the common horror story that we probably have all seen, not me personally, but my friend, is that deals fall apart right before you think they're going to happen, and you can waste a lot of time on a marriage that doesn't end up
on the
happening.
M&A or investment? You're talking about M&A?
More on the M&A side than the investment.
And what is it that why does it fall apart?
Somebody does a reorg, somebody turns out to not have as much money.
There's people involved in making
yeah,
decisions,
right.
lots of people involved in making high-pressure decisions.
I would generally say from the startup's perspective that nightmare happens because of a lack of potential partners. From the corporate side, they probably want to know that they're the only bright, shiny object, but from the startup side,
That's right.
given the difference in leverage and position, you probably want 2 or 3 potential partners to make sure that at least one of them happens.
Yeah, what I was going to say is this, is like a lot of these situations depend on who has the power, right? And if you're a startup, the way you gain power in that is either by having something that is truly differentiated in the market, or like Dave just said, it's I'm creating demand, right? And then you're creating your own auction, if you will. Now, you can't do that when you're 5 people necessarily, right? But obviously through that spectrum, that's when, the only way to, as a startup, you want to try and get fairer terms is you need to make, your situation stronger in that discussion, right? And once again, it's not nefarious. It's just something where it's just good business to sit down and if my only option is to negotiate with Dave, Dave's going to figure that out, right? And sooner or later, guess who's going to get the better deal?
So let's say you have that leverage. What do you do with it? What should you be asking for?
You go to town, baby.
If it's a partnership, if it's an investment, what should you be asking for? Or what should be
As a
getting into a
startup?
contract? Yeah.
Well,
More money.
yeah, exactly.
Well, probably even, I think the typical answer for startups, and maybe even driven by their investors, is more cash up front, as opposed to maybe a longer earn-out structure or situation.
That's in the case of an
That's
acquisition.
for M&A, yeah, right? Or are you thinking other things too?
Again, I'm sort of steering toward, I guess maybe there's a larger discussion about what should that process look like in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably a partnership to test drive whether it's going to work or not.
Mm-hmm.
An investment might happen in there somewhere, and then an acquisition if you're convinced that it's working at such a level of satisfaction that you want to own that forever.
Fair enough.
And so there's probably I think when Fred was making that comment, what he was probably saying is investment isn't necessarily going to give you a lot of insight that you couldn't get from a partnership.
You don't have to pay up front to
I think,
to
well,
understand whether you
I'm
wanna buy.
biased. I would say invest in a fund, you'll get better value than if you invest in a company.
Well, but there's something real there. I mean, if you do look at, virtually every early stage investor, they set up funds, right? And there's a reason behind that, right? Any individual investment is highly risky.
Absolutely.
And so guess what? Putting a fund together makes sense from a financial perspective. But
And I think that's what I was talking about from the M&A process.
Totally
is
right.
There's a diversification that you get from a large amount of investments.
Could not agree more.
You probably want to have a diversification strategy for acquisition.
I think it's a good point.
But you were saying, I mean, what would you see if you're in that startup position? What do you see out there that you should be grabbing from that?
Look, once again, so for me, it is a situation where I say, look, what am I going to benefit from this? And I'll pretend it's something, akin to customer or distribution access, right? The key in the negotiation or the discussion for me is, how do I prove myself at one level? And if I can prove it at a small level, you will then commit to do something more later. So it's a little similar to what you're saying from an acquisition perspective, but even if it's a distribution partnership, it's something like, okay, let's take a segment or let's take a geography. Let me prove to you the value. And if we can prove that out and it's valuable to you, then we are going to take these following actions to roll that out. Those are the kinds of things that I would always look for, because what startups really are looking for in the end is scale, right? Startups don't have scale. Big companies can help them get scale. But you can't walk in as a 15-person company, to United Health and say, hey, can we roll out everywhere, right? You got to prove yourself, right? You need to do that, and then, if you have power early on in the relationship, I don't think you take advantage of it. You take advantage of that to give yourself the opportunity to scale if you're successful.
I think there's, a stage at which startup is large enough to take advantage of some of that, and maybe that's more traditionally at Series B or even Series C. And let's say you're a company that's been successful in the US or in the English-speaking market, and you're thinking, hey, maybe Japan is an interesting place for me to go. You might accept a corporate VC relationship with somebody that can give you distribution into Japan.
Well said.
So when Salesforce has power in, at the negotiating table for a partnership or whatever, what will you be asking for? What are the key things for you?
I think it comes down to generally economic terms. I mean, you can demand better economic terms if you have the upper hand. Is probably the simple answer.
What are there, things on the side that you're looking for, whether it's a board seat or an observer role?
Oh, so
or
on
thing?
the investment side?
Oh, or investment or acquisition. I mean, are
on
there
the
other things on
investment
the
side,
side?
we're typically not leading rounds, and so we kind of want to remove ourselves from that by and large. So we're investing alongside institutional investors, so we're not setting the terms, and so it's not like we don't really want to get in the middle of that.
And Jeff, have you seen anything come up in these negotiations that has been helpful in future negotiations?
Yeah, on the M&A side, the one personal pet peeve I have is around earnouts, which Dave mentioned earlier. I'm just a straight no on earnouts. I think they're actually impossible to negotiate fairly.
Which means
They're very
what? That you have
difficult.
to hit a certain performance
The
metric?
concept is if you're employed here in 3 years and if you've hit this much revenue by spending this much money or so forth, you'll get this much extra deal consideration, usually with some variation of a sliding scale. Sometimes it's got like a derivative attached to it or something
Why
crazy.
do you think those don't work? I've heard that as well.
It's different
but
than retention. Just to be clear, different than retention, but this is like you have to hit goals to get.
Retention means purely you're staying there.
As long
Versus
as you're there,
earnouts,
and-
there's actual
yeah,
goals set.
yeah.
I just
Retention
think
is
it's-
usually amount of dollars reserved for the employees, not for
Right.
the
Right.
investors in the company, the shareholders in the company. It's purely for the employees to stay around, and typically
As long-
between 1 to 4 years.
Yeah. And fundamentally, it's like hard to agree up front on what the future might look like, and the strategy might
Right.
evolve. And so, like, we had a founder in our portfolio buying a small thing, and they came to me and they said, "Here's the structure. It's got this crazy earnout." And I'm like, "What are you trying to solve for? This is a very small deal,
Yeah.
and to add the complexity of a whole legal arrangement, what's going to happen in 3 years? They don't even know what they're going to do with the thing that they're buying. They might monetize it this way. They might monetize
Exactly,
it that
yeah.
way.
It
And if they
changes.
monetize it that way, it blows up the whole earnout, right?
That's
And so you're
right.
going to have people that come into the company that are going to have a financially vested interest in doing the wrong thing for the enterprise.
Yeah.
I said, like, it sounds like you've got a disagreement on value. Why don't you tell them that they're going to be important to your startup over the next 3 years? Why don't you give them a little bit more equity and say we're all in the same boat?
But I think you could use an earnout as a way to de-risk the cost and increase the payout. Yeah, I think that there are situations where, maybe the deal is $10 million up front and then $30 million to $50 million if it succeeds over the next couple of years.
But, yeah.
I think you'd be motivated to want to pay more if
I
it
think
actually
fundamentally
works.
it makes sense. I just agree that when you look at enough acquisitions, you might say, like, here's what we're going to do. That's the initial plan. You go to market and you realize, oh, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to shut down that part of the business. We're going to move you over here. Best intentions on both sides. Still a successful acquisition, but there's no way you'd hit that earnout. And I think it's too hard. I think it's too hard to predict that.
So
But
you said,
just as an example, if there's an earnout where some of that is supposed to come back to Greylock, notionally, we kind of put that at a zero.
Yeah.
It
It's,
doesn't-
it's a gravy, not
That's right.
part of the
That's
deal.
right. You
necessarily.
don't get excited about it. Now, but when it is in the case where it's earnout, to you said, for retention for the employees, to me that's a very different situation.
Most
there's an
earnouts
interesting-
lead to like massive arguments for a long period of time.
Totally
It's
right.
not
Yeah,
the thing you want to
totally
do if
right.
you're about to join forces.
Totally right.
And then they
Arguments
usually come
over-
down to control in some
That's fair.
either economic or very fundamental way, which says, look, if like the business isn't working in Asia, can we switch it and go to Europe? And like the buyer's not willing to like give that control legally and in a binding way to the founder of the company coming in. And then the founder says, well, if I don't have that control, how can I hit the thing?
Yeah.
And it just, I just don't
but you
like
said
it.
the
there's an
alternative is
interesting model
equity.
where
What are the
NASPER's-
alternatives? You said alternatives is equity. What other alternatives are there?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting model for a company like Naspers where they'll typically do a majority investment, not a complete acquisition, and they'll leave a remaining amount of ownership for the founders on the table as kind of the jewel. So they might buy 60 to 80% of the company and leave the founders with the remaining amount, and hopefully interests are aligned then so that that becomes more valuable. Sort of an implied earnout based on the remaining holdings that they have.
It's a better solve.
So in the M&A space, are there other deal terms that have, evolved over the last couple of years because of the new entrants in the field? I mean,
Well, Mark hit on a couple, more, an enterprise or a corporate will come in and say, I want to write a first refusal to buy. Like, as a venture firm, this is very self-serving, so just take that for what it is. We hate those things, right? Because it basically says, venture firms make their returns when a company gets outsized scale, and basically a right of first refusal means, wow, the company did everything great. We're not going to get the upside. So just understand that, if right of first refusals are very important to you as a corporation, the other players like venture firms are just going to hate that.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes we swallow and take it, but you do, right? But other times, believe me, we'll do everything because, at one level, it is a misalignment of interests. And in all seriousness, hopefully not too self-serving, right? We do our best to align interests, right? Trust me, a lot of the terms that get put into venture-style deals, I think many of the best investors try to keep the terms very clean, right? Not all follow that strategy, but I hope we do a pretty good job of that. But the short is, I think the cleaner the deals are for early-stage companies, the better, just because nobody wants to financial engineer something that's worth $5 or $10 million, right?
And I think the corporate world's evolved, and I think you're seeing lesser of that
That's right.
too. I mean, and the people that have been investing in the valley, they've been doing it for a while, and so you don't see as much of that. So I think
that's
yeah.
corporate VC and corporates in the valley that are tech-centric and experienced. I don't think that's true for
I think that's
a
right.
lot of folks
Yeah, I
coming
agree.
into
I'm saying you have to have that history of investing for a while.
Yeah, and again, I think that it is this mindset of corporates thinking of themselves as sort of like VCs. I think corporates in the Valley have gotten that level of familiarity and understand kind of how to play that game. I think there's a lot of new entrants now.
Yeah.
As tech starts to spread into a lot of areas that were traditionally non-technical, you're going to see a lot more corporates having to figure that process out.
And we're very realistic. We realize that we're not the most likely exit for these companies. We have a portfolio of over 180 companies. We've had dozens of exits. We've only acquired a handful of those companies, and so we're pretty forthright. Our goal is we want to help accelerate your growth. We want you to do great things in and around our platform. That's going to make our customers happy. That makes our GMs happy. They're getting, access to all this innovation without having to build it. But at the end of the day, we know we're not a likely acquirer, and so your terms of the deal have to be commensurate with that.
So we don't need notification provisions next time?
Dang.
Wow.
I think one of the interesting benefits of a lot of non-tech companies looking at startups is you're starting to see wholesale outsourcing of the R&D function to the startup and venture community. Like I think, and that's actually a positive thing. I think a lot of innovation and research is happening much faster in the startup community than it's happening in a traditional R&D lab, and probably happening a lot cheaper as well. But the flip side of that, I think, is corporates having to understand like how to be, again, that bright, shiny object. I would say that comes from them, having regular interaction with startups, building a large portfolio of potential partnerships, investments, acquisitions, and being in the market frequently. I don't think corporations are going to figure out how to be a great partner for startups if they do $1 billion deal every other year. I think they're much more likely to figure that out by doing a $50 million deal every quarter.
So before we turn to some audience questions, I want to turn to that last thing, which is, let's say you do get acquired, or you do like what's coming out of that R&D lab. You partner, you get acquired, whatever it is. How do you actually integrate what's coming out of the lab? That's where everything goes wrong, right?
I think that's a big part of why a lot of M&A things don't work, is the difference in cultures. And you can write the deal terms as awesomely beautiful as you want for a very attractive number, and then shit falls apart when this culture doesn't fit with this department.
So I think one of you was telling me there was a recent story where things did work out. Any of you have sort of an example where things worked out and why?
PayPal and eBay, as much as there was different cultures, amazing product fit and integration and immediate bottom line
What
impact.
did they do right?
That was a special case where I think PayPal was built for eBay, and it was really when eBay stopped pushing back to let that acquisition happen. That acquisition happened 4 different times before it actually happened.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of times in investment or partnership, you get to know each other ahead of time, spend time, and I would say honestly, some of our acquisitions that have been successful, a lot of it was the people. If what you were doing initially maybe didn't work out, but you get really talented executives who go on and build really great stuff, and by spending time with them and making sure that there's a cultural fit, you still feel like you get a lot of value out of that. And again, it's kind of like getting married. You can't just like meet right away. And I think it goes back to the point you said, like when's the right time to engage with the company. The flip side of that, the worst time to make your first engagement with a company is when like, hey, we got an offer, you're our preferred buyer, like can we talk? Because it's really hard for that group to respond really quickly. So if you have an investment, if you have a relationship, otherwise you may end up going to a less desirable acquirer if this is the first time that, even though it's a great fit, it's the first time you've kind of talked to one another.
But how do you make that not be a negative signal if you're reaching out, at some point to a bunch of companies?
Hi, we're ready to be sold.
No, I'm saying you reach out early, like to partner or invest. So like when we invest in a company, we socialize them internally. They get a lot more visibility, and so there's a lot more familiarity. There's a lot more engagement at the executive level, and so those types of things. And you don't have to do it through an investment. You can, like you said, eBay and PayPal knew each other quite well, so you want to have that relationship.
All friendly, right?
Sometimes not very friendly, yes. But it was interesting going from having Meg on a dartboard on a wall to immediately the next day coming in and saying, "Hi, I'm your new boss." That was
maybe not the best example.
Well, but to me, I think there's plenty of ways to interact. So, for example, let's say one of the benefits is, I'm a big company. Your product, we can sell a lot. It's a good complementary product. As a startup, there might be 2 or 3 folks out there where that makes sense. So why wouldn't I, even if my goal was to be acquired, go out and start strategic conversations that have nothing to do with an acquisition, but talk a lot about what are the ways that we can work together, and what are ways, I'd love to get additional distribution. It turns out that, a few of those conversations will probably turn into, hey, have you ever thought about this? Maybe kinda if we maybe owned 100% of you, So, but part of it is getting to know each other, and those conversations can happen in lots of ways. We always encourage our companies and our CEOs, look, get to know the key folks in your ecosystem. And it's not prime the pump for acquisition. It's like you got to get to know your ecosystem, right?
Exactly.
And so to your point, you should never. It's just like raising money from a venture firm. The first time you talk to a venture firm shouldn't be, "Hi, my name's Tom. Would you look at my deck or interested in investing?" Like that's the last time you should be.
Or the first time you ask someone to marry you is probably probably not. It's best, like, not on the first
Well
meeting.
said.
But the key to integration can't just be being chummy with everyone, right? There's got to be more to it.
Well, but go back to your thoughts, Dave. So is it the people? Okay, if it's the people that you want to gain from this, you better set up a way to integrate where the people are going to want to stay, right? So look at Instagram and Facebook as a really
It's
good.
always the people.
Almost always the people.
Even if it's
Well,
the technology,
well,
it's the people.
Not always. Sometimes it's an accretive financial transaction where I am much more interested in this product and making sure I can drive that product hard.
Or just buying a competitor to shut it down.
That's
That's an
special
expensive
case.
risk.
Yeah,
That's an
that can be done.
There's always corner cases.
That's
I
true.
mean, actually, it was interesting in PayPal's case. Most of the senior founder exec team actually left within 6 to 12 months.
That's right.
I mean, Peter on the first day, I think Reed within a few months. Ruloff, in an interesting situation, was actually forcibly moved out.
No comment.
And Max, they kept for at least a year.
Is that right? I didn't realize that.
But then they should have kept him longer, but they decided not to. But that was the case where, like, of the 3 or 4 senior folks,
Well, but
they were all
even
gone within a year.
but look at a more recent example with Venmo, with PayPal. Like Venmo, it's a really interesting, through Braintree, right? Venmo has thrived within PayPal.
I think PayPal's actually done a great job in more recent years of acquiring companies and moving the founders of those acquiring companies into senior positions. Actually, David Marcus, before he went over
That's right.
to the
That's
messenger
right.
team at,
That's right.
at Facebook, was running PayPal.
That's a really good
and
point.
Was one of the best.
And
folks they had.
moving founders to senior positions accomplishes what?
I mean, again, that may be a question of politics within, a corporate environment, but I might argue that, there's a great opportunity for fresh blood, so to speak, by acquiring, startup founders and talent and keeping them engaged in a corporate, hopefully for at least a couple years.
And if you're acquiring their business, they need to be in a position to be able to make decisions too. So I mean, there's different ways to bring in talent.
I think the best situations are usually when the acquiring company is growing faster than the parent, and that's usually the scenario where the parent is going to give more freedom to the, child is probably not the right word here, but the acquired company to continue growing. And I think that, probably happened in the PayPal eBay situation. I think it happened in the YouTube Google situation. Certainly it's happened in the WhatsApp and Instagram situations with Facebook.
It's well said.
What are people thinking about? Let's have an audience question.
Yeah, so we see lots of corporates feel the need to visit Silicon Valley and drink up the innovation. And at CB Insights, we call that the Silicon Valley petting zoo.
Disneyland tour.
How important in reality is proximity in your view to Silicon Valley?
Oh, proximity is really important, but
It is.
a 1-week trip out of a year is not going to change your corporate strategy or get you to know what's going on in the valley.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we say a lot, and I know Jeff does a lot of this as well, but we will do some of these hosting or briefings, with different enterprises or corporates. And look, I always say to folks, look, if this is a one-time visit, we're happy to have you, and there's some small amount of value, but the real goal here is to build a relationship. I like to think of these things as you should, as a corporate, I think you should be building out sort of your network of sensors, if you will. So, a venture capitalist, a partner like Oracle or EM, a big technical partner, it could be a bank that has a lot of, understanding of what's going on in Silicon Valley. But to me, build out your network of sensors, right? And those sensors should be helping you understand different pieces, right? And so that's the kind of the way
So
I
it's
think
sort
about it,
of
and it's
being-
not a one-time visit.
So it's sort of being close by proxy.
That's right.
I think you've seen there's been a couple of larger Chinese internet startup companies that have set up shop in the valley. I think Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu. So they're not coming for just a 1-week visit. They're there, and they're doing deals, and they're seeing what's happening on the ground, and they have a pretty high level of awareness of interesting stuff that's coming up in the valley.
Or even things like, as diverse as Kohl's has a big group in Silicon Valley that first was their digital and now is taking over more and more of their, kind of internal technology. You look at the car companies, obviously, with autonomous vehicles, they're all setting up there. But AstraZeneca has set up a CTO's office in San Francisco. So there's a good number of folks that have gotten to know the Valley and then committed more to it. Is that the right place for every company? Of course not. But it's an example just that I know.
I think it tends to work better when you've got a proper reason to do business in Silicon Valley.
That's right.
So you have a chunk of your business and actual practitioners doing actual work. The model that seems a little bit more structurally difficult is when you have like a scout that's trying to be the one that's keeping eyes and ears on what's going on in Silicon Valley and then pushing that back to the home office. And oftentimes what we see in that model is that there's not a full sync between the scout and the actual practitioner, and so the scout could fall in love with the founder of technology, a business, or what have you, but then trying to push that back into the mothership just usually doesn't work. It's really got to be pulled by the practitioner themselves.
I think that's a place where you could use an accelerator as an interesting first step to get familiar with the Valley, and maybe your step is, hey, I want to start having some visibility to potential startups that might integrate with my corporate entity, and maybe we do some funding for companies that would be in that sort of satellite or might be integrated with our platform. And if that works well, I think what you end up seeing is the corporates take that program and run it internally themselves, and they probably build a more established presence in whether it's Silicon Valley or other tech sectors where talent might be on their radar.
Just to start. Another question?
Great. Yeah, this will be the last question because we're running a little bit over. But yesterday, Chamath talked about the role corporates play, especially in healthcare, and the differences in working with founder-led corporations. Have you seen any differences in behavior in terms of the different slices within corporates, whether that's sector or CEO or just structuring of the company?
I think there's a big difference between founder-led corporates and non-founder-led corporates. I think culture is such a huge part of what makes companies work and thrive over time. And oftentimes, if you lose the founder and you have a transition to more of a professional manager, it's very difficult to kind of keep that culture intact and keep that kind of guiding light, if you will.
So how do you compensate for that if you're a corporate in that situation? Where, I mean, it's the same question that I was sort of asking Matt earlier. If you're not in a favorable position, what do you do?
Well, but look at, I mean, for me, a great example is Microsoft, right? If you came to Silicon Valley 3 years ago, and talked about Microsoft as a great partner, you'd have a lot of technology executives say, not so sure. But you look at what Satya's done in the last, is it 2 years? Maybe it's a little longer. I mean, it's once again, just from the lens of, how Microsoft is viewed as a potential partner, obviously acquirer with LinkedIn, but potential partner to the technology companies in Silicon Valley, it's done like a 180. Yeah. I mean, to me, it's truly stunning. Now, once again, is that the only right metric? Of course not.
I don't know about 180, but maybe let's say 90 to 120.
Come on, give them a little more credit.
I think it goes back to what what Mark said too. You have to have executive buy-in. How do you know you have executive buy-in? If it's just a scout, 2 people, that's probably not executive buy-in. But if you look at someone like GE, they have a software center here. They've had an investment arm for how many decades now. And so I think that there's just a lot of things that you can do. It's not just one thing. It's not one trip. So you have to have a commitment, more people, more engagement. So there's no one size fits all, but you just have to see that there's true commitment on multiple levels, that you have very senior people in the organization that are clearly committed to it.
I think you need to have a coordinated strategy that you exercise regularly. I mean, I don't think you figure out the startup world by, again, sort of doing a big billion-dollar acquisition once every 2 or 3 years. I think you have to get to know the people who are doing interesting technical work in your field. I think you need to either be doing partnerships, be doing investments, doing acquisitions so that you're on their radar. And they have some trust that you are doing deals, not just like this is your first time. Yeah, I think being in the market when the fish are running is probably a big part of it.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you guys sharing your thoughts, and thank you everyone for joining us. I think that's it for us.
All right. Well, fun.